State Senator Jamal Bailey, thanks so much for being here in New York Now this week. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. I always appreciate talking to you.
Anytime. So you sponsored a few of the bills that were passed this week in response to the death of George Floyd. One of them that got a lot of attention is the repeal of Civil Rights Law 50A, which means that now people will be able to request under the Freedom of Information Law the disciplinary records of police officers. And I'm wondering, just from somebody who may not know what this is all about, if I were somebody that was going to request those records and say I get some records back that show a police officer had a pattern of abuse, of excessive force, what would I do with that information? Why would that information be useful for somebody to have?
Well, it's important to know who's policing your streets, Dan, who is policing our streets. If somebody has a history of repeated excessive force or repeated activities that go beyond the pale of what policing by and large should be, I think that's important that the public is well aware that you have these actors on the force and that we can now have that information to hopefully utilize that to remove these bad actors so that the police department, which again, I'll say it here, like I've said it multiple other places, by and large, the vast majority of police officers go to work every single day and they do the right thing. I think having information about those who don't do the right thing is quite helpful in helping to turn our police departments around and, most importantly, increase public trust.
You had a debate this week with Republicans on the Senate floor talking about part of the bill on substantiated versus unsubstantiated claims. So the bill as it's written now and will become law makes it so that both substantiated claims and unsubstantiated claims will be available to the public. And the Republicans argued that these unsubstantiated claims shouldn't be available because, in theory, they weren't proven to be true. Talk me through your thinking of including both substantiated and unsubstantiated claims.
So, one, we don't have a uniform disciplinary process throughout the state of New York when it comes to alleged police misconduct, right? So we don't know, like the CCRB in the city of New York, right? That's where the language of substantiated versus unsubstantiated generally comes from. So we don't know how other departments throughout the state are handling these misconduct claims, especially those who don't have these civilian complaint review boards, which is what CCRB stands for. Dan, I apologize for said that at the outset. So we don't know what the process is. Secondly, as I mentioned on the floor as well, just because something is unsubstantiated, it doesn't mean that it didn't occur. There are many reasons why complaints may not go forward. It may be people simply lose faith with the system. So, and again, we don't know the metrics as to how these cases or alleged cases. I want to make sure that we say alleged cases of police misconduct are given. We don't know how they're adjudicated. And again, it's an entirely internal disciplinary process that the public still has no insight on. So we don't know how these decisions are being made. So it's critically important that we have the ability to see these complaints.
So you're chair of the Senate Codes Committee, which means that you have had a lot of conversations with both criminal justice advocates and members of law enforcement on this issue. I'm wondering from your perspective, because you're arguably one of the most informed people on this issue in the state, what do you think it will take to get us to a place where there isn't this tension between communities of color and members of law enforcement?
Legitimate, open, and sometimes raw conversations. As Senator Akshar and I debated each other on the floor yesterday, while we may not agree on the substance of the legislation, one thing that I can tell you is that I have a great deal of respect for Senator Akshar, not only as a legislator, but as a former member of law enforcement. We don't have the same views because we grew up differently, because we have different political theories, but that doesn't mean we can't have conversations. I would say the same thing happened in the Senate Standing Committee on Codes the day before, where we had, I think, the longest meeting that I've ever held. And Senator Gallivan mentioned as well that we had some really frank conversation. And my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, like Senator Gallivan, Senator Lanza, Senator Flanagan, Senator Akshar, and Senator Boyle, we've had conversations, Senator Robach as well, we've had conversations about policing. And again, we may not agree on on the end result, but it's critically important to have those conversations. And one of the things that even if people don't agree, Dan, with what necessarily I say or I do, one thing that I pride myself on, and I will always do, is listen to what people have to say. And it's not just passively listening. I will really take into consideration what people say, even if I don't necessarily agree with it. I think that's what we're supposed to do as lawmakers when we're crafting policy that will affect our entire state, not just the Bronx, but Broome County and in Buffalo and in Brooklyn and all the other B's with the alliteration that I can mention, right? I think that's critically important that we listen. And I think that's having these uncomfortable conversations. Put us in a room sometimes and socially distance now, or even on a Zoom now, but we have to have these conversations so that we can get to a better place.
All right, State Senator Jamal Bailey, thanks so much for being here. I really appreciate your perspective. It's a really unique perspective that we have here in the legislature.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.